First, for the EPP, Mr. Fernandes, for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, President. My greetings to you all. I'd like to devote a particular tribute to the Commissioner, who's shown how competent he is, and pay tribute to the way that the time frames have been respected and the cooperation that's been achieved. It's important that the MFF after 2020 can meet the challenges that we face in the European Union. We want an EU that will be more competitive and have more cohesion, and at the same time show more solidarity. So the challenges have been identified. The cohesion policy needs to be continued. The common agricultural policy needs to be strengthened. We need to strengthen research and Erasmus and give more support to SMEs. And young people need to be a priority, and that's going to require strengthening the youth employment initiatives. There's also the challenges of security and defence, and that's why it's terribly important that the European Union's budget can be adequate, can be sufficient to help us meet these challenges. 1.3% of gross national income is nothing special. It's not out of this world. It's a realistic proposal. But furthermore, these sources of finance need to be achieved without overburdening Europe's citizens, Europe's taxpayers. Hence the proposal that we're making, which would help to make this this challenge so that fines and profits from the EIB can be incorporated.
Mr. Fernandes, a blue card request for you from Madame Grappini. Blue card. Do you accept? Yes, Madame Grappini, for half a minute.
Thank you, President. Colleague, I agree to what you said, but among other things, you spoke about some priorities, about cohesion, about
there was no Portuguese translation.
Nu există. Am o întrebare pentru Rapin. So I have a question for you. I agree to a lot of what you have already stated. And what the Commissioner said and what the colleague said didn't result into the fact that during the next period of the MFF we should think about a budget to allow the development of tourism. Although tourism creates a number of jobs, contributes to GDP, and do you think it would be useful to have a budget line for tourism as well in the new MFF, and the additional resources which were mentioned here should also be used?
For tourism, Mr. Fernandes, please.
Thank you very much. It seems like a setup, because other colleagues and myself have made a proposal with a view to the MFF, including a line on tourism, and in our report, I guess there's no translation, says the speaker. This interpreter feels that there is.
In our report, that's inside our report. Thank you.
So I understand well that that was not a setup. That was not agreed. No. No, we're just referring to what you have said.
I can try again.
No, that's fine. Sorry, misunderstanding. It was just... you said that it looks like a setup, so I was asking you, it was not a setup. I understand not. Anyway, let's proceed now with a serious note, and that is 3.5 minutes for Ms. Viotti for the S&D Group.
Grazie, Presidente. Grazie.
Thanks very much, Mr. President. Thank you, Commissioner, for your statement on the work that we're doing, which will be very useful for us in the forthcoming months. We're talking about something very important here this afternoon, colleagues. It's not just two documents from the European Union. We're actually trying to design the future of the very European Union. And these documents, these reports, and the work that's being carried out by the Commission need to give a new sign, a different sign, because Europe's going to need a new image, and to do that we need new policies. We need new policies which give a new vision and a new future. On the two things that we're talking about in these weeks and months, the new MFF and the question of own resources, on the MFF, Mr. Fernandes has just said, and you yourself, Commissioner, said that 0.3% isn't a dream. It's something that's easily achievable. And this Parliament isn't particularly demanding. It's, I think, a very responsible Parliament. We know what citizens want, and we know what kind of responses we need to give to them. And we're talking about the added value for our citizens, for SMEs in particular, on huge issues such as development, research, young people, growth, environment, energy, culture. There's a whole series of things that colleagues have already mentioned. These are all enormous challenges we've set ourselves. So we need more resources. You've said they shouldn't be additional, they should be parallel resources, but make certain we've got enough resources. That's the key thing, enough resources to carry out these ambitious policies. We're going to have to ask for less from member states. That's quite correct, you're in saying that, Commissioner. But in the document which the rapporteur made available, both the one on the MFF and the one on own resources, these resources are extremely clear in these reports, and the areas where we need to work have been fully staked out. But we need to give a very clear message to citizens. We don't want to increase taxation on citizens. We don't want to bring in new taxes or increase the burden on SMEs. What we want to do is redesign the own resource system in the European Union and come up with a fairer Europe when it comes to finances, a greener Europe, a Europe where financial transactions are finally taxed. Finally, President, let me just talk about the time frame. We heard, and I agree with you, that we need to sort this out by the end of the Bulgarian presidency, both on the MFF, that's to say, and on the own resource system. But we need to sort these out quickly but well, because these are responses we need to provide our citizens, and we need to make certain we have prospects for our citizens in the world post-2021 which are going to meet the challenges that we'll be faced with and that researchers and industries are asking us to do, as well as our citizens. Thank you, President.
For 2 minutes with Mr. Kilmel for the ECR group.
Thank you very much, President. The new multi-annual financial framework is the test of what type of EU we want in the future. Just about everybody is talking about more subsidiarity, cutting red tape and savings, but the draft here doesn't give us that. And to this previous speaker, he said that, speaking to the socialist representative, we need more money because we know how to boost the economy. We know how to boost startups, etc. Colleagues, I don't believe that. I don't think that we know that better than the managers of companies. They know how to get the economy going. We should give them the framework conditions, but we shouldn't collect money in the member states and redistribute it via Brussels. That's the opposite of a slimline EU. We should create free spaces. Cutting red tape means less rules and not more. And if you want to have less rules, there shouldn't be more budget resources. I ask myself, what can I really achieve? And it's clear the EU budget is largely a program budget. And in a program budget, the most obvious thing is if a member state leaves, the programs are run down. But now it's being suggested that the contributions of the member states based on GDP should be increased by 30%. That's the opposite of a slimline and value for money EU, and that's what the citizens want. So I plead that only new resources, if we have a political approach to solve crises, for example, migration or the euro crisis. But we must have the political willpower there. Instead of that, we see that the resources for the previous ESM are being put into a temporary budget line.
Run out of your slot. We will now proceed with the speaker for the ALDE group for 2 minutes, Ms. Arthuis.
Thank you, President. I would like to welcome the commitment and undertaking on the part of the Commissioner and also pay tribute to the 4 co-rapporteurs. If you take a look at these 2 own initiative reports and we vote them and adopt them, then we will be voting the necessary means and resources to be able to conclude the negotiations on this with the Council before the end of this Parliament, which will obviously mean that we'll have managed to do it in a shorter time than 2014-2015, and we'll have done away with the tyranny of the fair return, juste retour. We do need flexibility, we need that margin, and we know that when it comes to the implementation of the current MFF, it's been rather difficult for us to face up to the challenges posed by certain crises. Globalization means that member states are having to face up to unprecedented challenges when it comes to security, to defense, migration, the digital economy, climate, the fight against globalized terrorism. And we have to be prepared, and we have to collectively assume responsibility and face up to these challenges, because we have a common European good that we need to defend. And at the national level, in certain member states, we realize that they don't have the necessary means to face up to these challenges. And it should be possible, Commissioner, the day after the next European Parliament elections in 2019, that if we have the necessary majority and if member states agree to go beyond 1.1, 1.2, 1.3%, then we would be a global European power, 1.3%. I don't think that is really going to be such a shock to member states or digital companies. I think it should be possible to transfer expenditure that's been allocated at the national level to the European Union level, and then, Commissioner, you would be able to prove and show just what European value added is. We would be far more efficient when it comes to implementing national resources through the European budget. We'd be able to show that we can increase the European budget without increasing public expenditure in Europe, and that is my desire. Thank you.
Now for the Greens group for 2 minutes, Mrs. Soleil.
Thank you, President. Dear Commissioner, colleagues, this Parliament has to send a clear message to the Commission and to the Member States concerning the next MFF. If we want an ambitious EU, a Union able to deal with key challenges of our times, to deliver real outcomes in terms of progress, sustainability, equality and fundamental freedoms, then we need to reverse the downward trend in the amount spent by the EU, a trend that has been aggravated by the current MFF. If we need to fight against growing populism and Euroscepticism, the worst thing we could do would be to adopt proposals from populists and from Eurosceptics, because with a smaller budget, the European Union will be unable to deliver, and thus it would be even more meaningless to those many people who already don't see what the EU is here for. In other words, to demonstrate the added value of the EU, we need to invest more and more efficiently into policies where the EU can really make a difference. So this has to be the first key message to the Member States. Don't use Brexit to make further cuts in our budget and diminish our ambitions. Secondly, the next MFF needs to focus more on delivering results in sustainability and in the fight against climate change. The EU must translate its commitment with the Paris Agreement into a real budgetary priority. That's why our group stressed so much the importance of aligning the EU budget with the Sustainable Development Goals and to significantly increase the climate-related spending to reach at least the 30% target as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, colleague. Now for the GRUE group, for 1 minute and a half, Mr. Marché.
Merci.
Thank you. Commissioner, we are gradually edging towards this key moment where there is no doubt about the future of the budget of the European Union. I thought that it's not a big risk to say that after 2020 we'll continue to be within the logic of austerity, doing more with less, spend better, budgetary cuts, intelligent budget cuts. So that's the only logic, but it's not very dynamic. That's what's going into the current negotiations, and which is covering over any European ambitions and our European ambitions. And in that context, the question that we ask ourselves, and which disturbs us, is this budget that of the start of the end of cohesion policy and the weakening of the CAP? I would say, if it's on the backs of cohesion policy, that we think that we can find the necessary resources to finance new priorities, which aren't EU obligations. And it's up to you to denounce it.
Now for the FDD for 1 minute, Madame Montel.
Merci.
Yes, thank you. Dear colleagues, Brexit, the referenda that you're losing around Europe, the Italian general elections, none of these seem to have affected the ivory tower that you reside in. If we take there was the chaos surrounding the ivory tower, and now you're asking for a larger budget for the European Union. The pro-Europe religious zealots are asking for a European Defence Union, European Army, and now they're asking for even more. How can we tell you to make you understand that nobody wants your European Union? The 24 languages of the European Union are not enough. Should we perhaps have to tell you this in Esperanto so that you can deign to listen to what you're being told you're listening to, and you come up with proposals which are even crazier one after the other. But these kind of hot flushes are nothing to do with a promise of a rosy future, but a kind of European menopause. And when it does finally decline, it'll be celebrated by a happy European people.
For 1 minute and a half, Mrs. Zanni.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think that when we're talking about the new MFF and own resources, we should keep two guiding principles in our minds. First of all, nothing should worsen member states' tax burden, in particular the gap where countries are net contributors to the European budget shouldn't be increased. Second principle, taxation. We don't want new taxes from Europe levied on European citizens, because that won't help, because Europe has no legitimacy to levy taxes. Unfortunately, the majority position in this House on these two issues look like violating these two principles. We need more. We're asking more from member states, particularly those who are already contributing in a considerable way to the EU budget, and that we are concealing new taxes behind the name of own resources. The CO2 tax is a tax, the tax on plastic is a tax, the tax on financial transactions is a tax. And we're fully aware of how well multinationals are able to palm off extra costs we try to put on them onto the final consumers. Unfortunately, then we're going to have a broader debate, because the tendency, particularly when it comes to the European elections, is that they want less Europe and more member states, and we should listen to them. Thank you.
For 1 minute, Mr. Fontoulis.
We repeatedly use words in the European Union trying to describe in a complicated way things that are actually quite simple, and things like own resources and payments are words like that. We need to look at the way the European budget is put together and what happens to member states when their citizens pay for these budgets. We need to remember that citizens are the people who are in the front line as far as all of this is concerned. What the European Union does is simply ask more from its citizens and from its member states, and the citizens are becoming tired with it. The benefits of this are very hard to discern because of ever-increasing levels of bureaucracy. The differences between member states and the state bodies which already exist could be used. That might give us the same benefits at much lower cost. Thanks very much.
Thank you, colleagues. That completes the list of speakers on behalf of the political groups. So we will now proceed with 1 minute and a half for Mr. Lamassoure.
Thank you, President. I'd like to congratulate the Commissioner and the rapporteurs. It's the hour of truth. Nobody can claim that with 1% of GNI it's possible to finance the traditional European policies, the decisions taken on migration, climate change or defence, and future priorities of the 2020s. The best proof is that the European budget has exploded. The small community budget of 20 years ago is being added to satellite budgets. There's the old moon of the European Development Fund. There are 4 urgent trust funds, 4 funds for Greece, the European Stability Mechanism, the Stability for loans outside the Eurozone, and the Euro Fund, etc. And 2018 starts up with a new satellite, which is a fund of funds being announced. So the negotiations on the next MFF have 3 top topics. How much are we prepared to cough up for financing European policies? How will we finance them? By what economies? By what new resources? How can we ensure democratic control, that is to say, by the Parliament? And those are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves.
Cool. Next for 3.5 minutes, Madam Garcia Rubial.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner, today we're facing one of the most important debates of the whole mandate, because what we're discussing now is the kind of Europe that we want to construct over the next decade. It's not only a budget debate, I think essentially it's a political debate, because wherever the money goes, the resources go, those will be the true priorities of the European Union. Under this Parliament, we've signed a lot of important agreements, the fight against climate change, an agreement for a real European pillar of social rights and for sustainable growth. And now we're having to decide how we're going to finance the European Union. And now is the time when we're going to show just what our degree of commitment is. We've been hearing very philosophical statements when there is discussion of the budget. Some say that the budget has to be reformed. Others say we have to do more with less. That's okay if you're talking about a headline in a newspaper, but if you're discussing the budget, it's not possible. You can't do more with less. Modernising the budget doesn't mean that we cut the budget, quite the contrary. The European Parliament has some very clear ideas as to what they want for the future MFF. 3 main areas of ideas. First of all, we have to maintain the funding for the traditional policies, cohesion and agricultural policies. We're asking of our farmers and livestock farmers that they produce to environmental standards, that they provide quality products which are affordable, that people stay in rural areas, and that young people go into farming. And you cannot do that with less money. And we also defend a strong cohesion policy so that Europe can continue to be competitive, and so that their regions can bring down inequalities, that they invest in innovation, and so that this competitiveness does not disappear or is not carried out at the expense of social and working rights of our people. If we take a look at some of the policies, it's not just a question of maintaining financing for a policy. We want to maintain the Erasmus program, innovation, investment. Then a third block. There are new needs, and new needs mean new budget, new monies. And just like the Commissioner said, we don't want to see that we're pitting one set of priorities against another. There are two ideas that I would like to put forward, and I hope the Commissioner listens carefully to them. First of all, conditionality of funds when member states don't respect the rules. We are suggesting a system of sanctions for member states that don't respect these rules. But these sanctions should not be linked to the cohesion funds. The regions, the unemployed, are not those who are responsible for governments not respecting their commitments. A second idea, bearing in mind the commitments that the European Union has taken on fighting climate change, a lot of regions, a lot of member states are going to have to move to quite a strong industrial and energy transition. And we want to have fair transition where responsibility is not only borne by the regions, but there is a greater support for the social aspects of this. So how can we finance all of this? Well, with new own resources, and look at those sectors that aren't making any contribution yet. Taxes on the large companies, those who make the most of the fact that there isn't any proper European regulation to evade paying taxes. I'd like to conclude now, President. I'd like to thank the four co-rapporteurs for the excellent work they've done, for their negotiation and their generosity when negotiating the reports, because this means that we have a very strong agreement supported by as many people as possible.
Kuźmiuk, for 1 minute and a half.
Yes, thank you very much, President, Commissioner. I've asked for the floor in this debate, and I'd just like to stress that the Polish delegation of the ECR obviously would like that we fill the Brexit gap, and that we have the right kind of resources for union priorities, because we have the GDP, GNI. We want to do away with the rebates. Now that we don't have the British rebate, and what about resources that have not been spent? They should be returned to the member state that have paid them. And we suggest a kind of levy so the United Kingdom has access to the single market. And then, of course, there's a digital tax. We have to maintain the current level of budgetary resources for the European cohesion policy. And we know that over the last 15 years, there has been discrimination against the agricultural sector in the new Eastern Central European countries. That should come to an end. Obviously, we have to strengthen the future budget. We have to respect what is in Article 2 of the TFEU, and we have to ensure that there's a proper objective criterion. We can't link this to any kind of lack of respect of rules. We have to have proper criteria. We have the Maastricht criteria, and these are selectively applied. And, for example, France, who has never respected certain criteria when it comes to Growth and Stability Pact, they have never been sanctioned.
Given more opportunity, there is a blue card request from Mr. Geyer. Do you accept? Blue card, Mr. Geyer. Yes, please go ahead with half a minute.
Thank you, President. Mr. Kuzmiuk, I listened to what you said. If I understood you correctly, your position is pretty much the opposite of what Mr. Kölmel in your group said just a few minutes ago. So my question is there a coherent position in the ECR group or not?
Half a minute for you to reply.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, it is true that when it comes to this particular issue within the ECR, there is not a uniform approach. So as the Polish delegation in the ECR, we would like to see a greater budget so that we can fill the gap which will appear after Brexit, so that we have also financing of new priorities. And there are certain fundamental issues in the ECR when it comes to budgetary discipline, and the Polish delegation, as I said, thinks that we ought to have a greater budget.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's not much that can be said about structural problems in the multi-annual framework in 1 minute, but I try. There is a very interesting study out there, Economic Challenges for Lagging Regions, and there is a case study in this study about Campania. And Campania, that's the region around Naples, and there is a saying about Naples, see Naples and then die. And as soon as the cohesion funds come to Naples, they die. Naples has been part of the system for 60 years, since the start of the regional and structural funds. And still today, Naples is lagging behind. And therefore, well, a person with normal intelligence and a person with normal intelligence in the Commission should probably understand that this form of structural funds doesn't function. Das geht nicht so weiter. Und ich glaube und ich hoffe.
I hope and I believe that Commissioner Oettinger can improve things a bit.
On the other hand, I must say that there are other beautiful things about Campania which are definitely on the peak. But anyway, I think we understood the message. Mrs. Hautala, for 1 minute.
Yes, thank you, President. Commissioner, I would like to draw your attention to one concern that I and my group have. We saw last week a paper, probably through a leak, that the Commission is planning to combine 12 external instruments into one. And my question to you is that, do you have a proper impact assessment on what this means for attaining, for instance, development effectiveness goals? What does it mean for defending such wonderful, very focused, quite small instruments like the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights? What does it mean for the goals that we want to achieve through the instrument contributing to stability and peace? My concern is that this new idea, which I think to some extent seems to be a response to the need of flexibility, will be a big mistake. I understand that flexibility is needed, but I don't think it should be done like this. And also, I believe that the European Parliament will lose a lot of its scrutiny rights if you do that.
Thank you. Next speaker for 1 minute, Mr. Benito Ziluaga.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I've only got a minute, so I'll get to the point. We need a bigger EU budget, but it shouldn't come to the detriment of member states' taxing capacities. But the two things should be complementary. We need to have progressive taxes as far as capital and income are concerned. We need more public resources, not fewer, to deal with the challenges faced by the people of Europe, particularly the employment precariousness, tax fraud. Tax fraud is something that could also be a good use, or a good source of income, along with eco-taxes or the financial transaction tax. Nevertheless, we could have, it seems like we have other priorities: strengthening Fortress Europe and militarising Europe, increasing, even doubling, defence expenditure. We don't share those priorities that the European Commission wants. Priorities should be different. Employment policy, backing small farmers, meeting international legislation on asylum, and changing our economies and regions. We need a stronger budget, but a fairer budget more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you. Now for 2 minutes, Mr. Valli.
Thank you, President. I agree with some of the things that have been said by colleagues about the priorities for the forthcoming MFF and budget. Youth unemployment, meeting the challenges of the migrant flow, the attempts to counteract global warming. But before we ask for more money from member states, i.e. taxpayers, ordinary people, we should seriously assess the performance so far. You're from Germany, Commissioner, so you should, I assume, be very careful about how European citizens' taxes are sent. You should look at every single programme to see whether it's working and bringing the appropriate results, and have an internal spending review before going with member states asking them for more sacrifices, particularly those that are already in difficulty in managing their public finances. Maybe it's not just their fault, as Mr. Torvald says, from the perspective of somebody from the north of Europe, but there are internal imbalances in the Eurozone which need to be addressed before we ask, or you ask, for more resources. Heads of state and government here need to find a solution, or the situation could become explosive. Unemployment and problems related to demand can't simply be solved with a European budget which isn't really all that big anyway. When it comes to own resources, once again, we can't have new taxes. European citizens don't want new taxes. They want financial speculation to be taxed. They want big multinationals to be taxed properly, but they don't want to have further tax burdens placed on themselves, which go into the pocket of some bureaucrat in Brussels. So we need to be more citizen-centred and not the usual people who drive the interests of the EU. Thank you.
For 1 minute, Mr. Briola.
Yes. What was said by Isabel Thomas show the failure of the EU, because she was talking about an oversized budget characterized by a lack of ambition and seriousness and budgetary impotence. Considering that European policies are inefficient for jobs, growth and purchasing power, considering that the budget leeway that you have are reduced, it should be the fact that the EU should concentrate on CAP and cohesion policy, and Brexit should be translated into a cut in union spending. You're proposing the reverse, to absorb new prerogatives like security and defence. There's two functions which are sovereign. They shouldn't be transferred to the Union. They should remain under the bailiwick of the member states. And you want to have 2% of VAT or invent new taxes. So before imposing austerity on the European peoples, the European Union should impose this on itself.
Now for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Mureşan.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Commissioner Oettinger, dear colleagues, the next multi-annual financial framework should reflect the political priorities which we expect from the Union in the next decade. And I believe it should be a balance between traditional priorities on the one side and new priorities on the other side. Traditional priorities, agriculture and cohesion policy, continue to be important because it is about rural development, it is about food security, and cohesion is about competitiveness, is about helping the least developed regions of the Union. And to these traditional priorities, new priorities are coming. The citizens of Europe expect us to do more on security, on defence, on tackling the migration crisis, on combating terrorism. And if at the end of the day we expect the Union to do more, it is not normal to only offer it a smaller budget. So we have, Commissioner, to stand together also in the negotiations with Member States, with the Council, and tell them if we expect a union, a more robust union, a union which has more tasks, then a smaller budget is not realistic. Of course we have to spend money well. Of course we have to update, modernise our policies, reform them, convince citizens that money are well spent, but at the end of the day, new competences of course means also a robust budget. And we have, to those countries, to those member states who are concerned, we have to tell them that paying more does not mean that you are in a war situation. If the Union should do more, and if we are also to contribute more, then it means that we all will also receive more in terms of security, combating terrorism and everything that the citizens expect. And this is of course in the interest of all governments of the Union. Just to conclude, one sentence on timing, Commissioner, dear colleagues. We will vote the Parliament's position tomorrow, and then of course you will make the proposal at the beginning of May. The Parliament, our team, will be ready to negotiate. Commissioner, please stand together with us, with the Parliament. in negotiations with the Council to convince them that the sooner we adopt the next MFF, the better it is. The Council should not adopt the next MFF when it's politically convenient for them, but when it's good for the beneficiaries in the Member States, for farmers, for students, for researchers, for young unemployed people. And I say the sooner we adopt it, the better for the beneficiaries. Thank you very much.
Mr. Muresan, there is a blue card for you. Do you accept it? From Mrs. Joannou, this blue card. Mrs. Joannou, half a minute.
Thank you, President. Thank you.
Domnule președinte, vă mulțumesc pentru că mi-ați dat cuvântul.
Illetve a kohéziós pénzeknek a részaránycsökkenése az egyben az ön felfogásában jelenti-e ezeknek az összegszerű csökkenését?
Would this mean that their total amount? Would this mean that the total amount would also shrink, or only the share?
There was a slight mistake. Mrs. Joannou was.
Doamna președinte.
Eli rouva Joanna, teillä olisi nyt.
Now you have half a minute for your blue card to Mr. Muresan. I understood that you wanted to do that.
What is this?
Köszönöm szépen, akkor ismét még.
Thank you. I repeat my question then. So, the colleague said that we have to retain the traditional priorities that the budget was following. Cohesion, agriculture should be retained, in other words. But everyone, or many, think that a smaller share would be also possible. I don't think the volumes should be smaller. Did I understand your compromise proposal in this regard?
Mr. Sani, my position is the following. I say we have to start these complicated discussions with setting the political priorities. I think we should not start by speaking about the amounts, because if we start by speaking about the amounts, every participant in negotiations will want to pay as little as possible and to receive as much as possible. And then I think the discussions will be divisive, difficult and conclusive. I think firstly we should find a political common denominator on what we want to achieve about the budget, and only afterwards we should speak about the precise amounts in absolute terms or in relative terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Muresan. There was a slight misunderstanding on the blue card, but we'll move on in the speakers list. The next speaker is Jens Geier. 2.5 minutes.
Frau Präsident.
President, dear Commissioner Oettinger, dear colleagues, we are facing a very important decision when it comes to the future of the European Union, because we say in Germany that a budget is the way you shape your policies, and we're thinking ahead to 2021, 2027, and we have to decide what we want to do and how we're going to finance that. We need feedback from the member states so that they let us know just what kind of European Union they really want, so that we have the necessary financial resources for that. It's good if we have the right kind of tools to implement the objectives of the European Union, but they have to be reflected in tasks and activities as well, which is equally important. Following the withdrawal from the United Kingdom, revenue will go down, and certain member states and then certain members of the European Parliament are of the opinion then expenditure would have to go down as well. If you take a look at the different tasks that we hear about from the member states, there are those who say that we ought to do more with less money. But you can do that in La La Land, perhaps, or maybe interviews in Scandinavian, Austrian, Dutch. Newspapers, and I would imagine in the British press as well, but not in our reality, unless, of course, Mr. Commissioner Oettinger, you have the golden goose, or as we call it, the golden donkey that eats straw and then gold comes out of the other end. Frontex, we've heard that that agency should be turned into a proper border agency. Then the European Fund for Defence Industry, etc. That we have to really have the necessary resources for the Posting of Workers Directive. We want to do more for young people, try and fight against people having to flee. And we know then we have to focus on research as well. And there are a lot of research projects that can't get up and running because there isn't enough money for this. And if we want to try and do all of this by way of activities, where do we get the money from? If we want an efficient and effective European Union, we can only do that if we have the necessary resources, the necessary funds, new own resources, and I think the time has come to get down to work.
Mr. Geyer, there's a blue card for you. And is Mr. Etheridge. Do you understand, do you accept the blue card? Mr. Etheridge, half a minute.
Thank you, and thank you for accepting the blue card. You mentioned the reduction in revenues following Brexit. Would it not be sensible for you to be looking at actually reductions in the scope of the ambition of this union to suit the new financial reality that will come from the far less revenue you'll get following Brexit, rather than seeking to continue to be all things to all men, even when you know that the money is going to run out?
Thank you, Mr. Geyer.
Mr. Etheridge was obviously only waiting for a catchword and then didn't listen to the rest of what I said, because I did further develop the idea. It's up to the member states to decide what kind of European Union we want. I've got all sorts of ideas. I can imagine, I may be a minority in my own political group, but I could imagine that we renationalise agricultural policy and have competition protection rules, and then coordinate to death. You can also think in terms of Erasmus and youth funds. You can do all of these kind of things, but it's up to the member states to decide what kind of European Union they want. My point is that if you want to do more with less, that just isn't possible.
Thank you, Mr. Geyer. The next speaker is Ms. Ruohonen Lerner. 1 minute. Thank you. When we talk about the MFF, we should take into account the impact of the Brexit on the union's income and tighten our belts so that we can make things work without cutting our objectives in the MFF. We should have concentrate on areas where there is clear European added value. That's to say, areas where acting at the European level can produce better results than at the national level. These include air pollution, like basic research, and the problem of robotisation to help old age care. Also, managing immigration. That's the best security policy in the member states, also the best social and cultural policy. Finances should be based on independent impact about assessments, and we should see what assumptions the studies are based on, and they should be transparent and open to criticism. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Ruohonen Lerner. The next speaker is Iskra Mihalova. 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, colleagues. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the authors of those reports because they were able to prepare a position for the European Parliament, a very timely position in order to start negotiations with the Council and in order to be able to support the Commission because it is about to make its proposal for the MFF. It is very important that in these reports we mention the need to achieve added value for the investment. Complementarity for the financial lines can lead to more efficiency and more flexibility in the future implementation of the MMF. Let me underline that this flexibility can also be achieved by attracting more private resources and by finding the necessary mix between private and public sources. Establishing the right framework will lead to the right balance as far as implementation is concerned.
Ja seuraava puhuja on edustaja Bas Eickhout. 1 minuutti, olkaa hyvä.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I fear really the outcome that you can already see being sketched. Coming from the Netherlands, I have a prime minister who is saying, oh yes, I want to make the budget future-oriented, but mainly it needs to be less money. What I feel here is that people say, yes, we want to make the budget future-oriented, but maintain the policies of the two big spending blocks on agriculture and cohesion. I can tell you what will come out of those negotiations. It will mean less money, but maintaining the same old policies that we have right now. And then, really, all the people that are criticising the EU will have a free day all to criticise that outcome. Therefore, really, I also plead to this House, focus on what you want, on the contents. Focus on the modernisation, on really making the EU budget future-oriented, really make agriculture green and make it deliver sustainable food. Look at the infrastructure to really connect us Europeans, really go for innovation, really fight youth unemployment, and then we can talk about the future-oriented policies. Otherwise, it will be less of the same.
Thank you, Mr. Eickhout. Next speaker is Martina Michels. 1 minute.
Dear colleagues, well, it is one question as to how we can actually fill the Brexit gap, but essentially we should be addressing the following question. What should the European Union of the future look like? Is it going to be a Europe based on solidarity, where solidarity is the most important part of the answer? And what about when we take a look at the debate on MFF, then I think we have to think in terms of instruments based on solidarity to strengthen cohesion policy, for example. And I'm hoping for clear replies from the Commission rather than just further proposals to reduce resources. We demand that there be no cuts in resources and funding, that the various financial resources not be used for imposing sanctions, and no single region should miss out on aid and support, financial support. We have to be careful that we don't make the situation worse. If we are asking for more money here and then blocking the path in the national member states, that is not a good idea. And we have to ensure that we do try and we want to invest in a fairer, more social, sustainable, free, peaceful Europe.
Thank you. The next speaker is Jörg Meuthen. 1 minute. Madam President, Commissioner, colleagues, I can't believe that we don't agree on what the next EU budget look like. After Brexit, there can't be any two opinions on this. The EU budget shouldn't be bigger, as is being discussed here. Of course, it should be smaller. The EU is losing its third largest net payment. The UK has paid about 40 billion euros over the last few years. That's 8 billion a year. Before cutting the budget, you're calling for taxes on plastic and diesel and higher taxes from the member states. That makes me speechless. Do you want to take that to your voters? If not, I'll be happy to do that. We have a clear and logical alternative. If the EU budget should be cut radically, no EU army, a radical cutting of cohesion funds, cutting agricultural subsidies, and shutting these Commission departments. And Mr. Guy, you said what you need more money for. Then we'd have enough money to have sensible projects like Erasmus. you can save money if you cut out these senseless policies. The citizens have enough of this EU, which is far from the citizens. Listen to the citizens, otherwise they'll be saying goodbye to the EU. Thank you, Mr. Moyton. The next speaker is Andre Ellison. 1 minute.
Voorzitter, de grote lijn van de voorstellen is dat de meerjarenbegroting.
The main lines of the proposal are attempting to address the problems caused by Brexit and some shady dealings with Libya and Turkey. This means that ordinary people are going to have to pay more. I have already objected because the Dutch citizens will have to pay more. We shouldn't even be paying as much as we're paying at the moment. The Netherlands should start paying less into the European project. The Dutch Prime Minister, Mr. Rutten, would be able to use these funds better at home. It's terrible how Mr. Selmayr has been promoted by you, Mr. President Juncker. He should be sent home, and we shouldn't even talk about this anymore.
Thank you, Mr. Ellison. Now, Thomas Zirkowski, 1 minute and a half.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure if it's just me seeing a sort of déjà vu listening to this debate, or whether you're feeling something similar as I am. Mr. Geyer did not speak about increasing the EU budget, did not ask the Netherlands for more money, rather talked about the need to look for our own resources to fund the EU. When looking for our own resources, it means that we'll be asking the member states to pay less, not more. If we are not listening to one another and only making political claims here, this debate becomes futile. Who has ever experienced this debate on own resources will see that the debate has always been open-minded, and always we get stuck on a certain point, be it an environmental tax, be it a service or transaction tax, whatever. But at the end of the day, we come together to a conclusion that the EU should become less dependent on the income from individual member states. I'm not in favor of crazy budget increases. Siegfried Mureşan clearly said that the money has to be spent effectively and efficiently, and this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about actually replacing the income from the UK by income from other member states after Brexit. Rather, what we're talking about is about finding a new way of funding this in the longer term. Thank you. I'm sorry for having overrun the time.
Thank you. The next speaker is Silvia Costa. 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank our 4 rapporteurs and say that in the light of the concerns of our citizens, in the light of the risks posed by Brexit, we need to make certain this MFF works politically. I think it's also time we deal with own resources as additional, not just substituting for national funding. Even though national funding can help co-finance investment, we shouldn't take money away from the stability tax. Let's have a wealth tax, a FTT. Let's make certain that ordinary people don't suffer in all of this, and make certain that digital issues are explored properly as far as their taxation is concerned. When it comes to the strategic priorities, we need to always look at young people and culture. They're the people who are showing us every day how they have hope in Europe and the hope in its sustainable future. We need to guarantee that for them. We've talked about tripling the funding for Erasmus. It should be 10 times more, because a very small number of people are only able to avail themselves of that instrument. And we should also be bolder when it comes to cultural policy, investing in the Europe's cultural and creative industry. At the moment, it's still too marginal in the public debate. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Ms. Costa. The next speaker is Charles Goerens. 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. 1%, 1.05%, 1.1%, 1.2%. If we take a look at these figures, we're not talking about homeopathy or nanosciences, but these are the maximum amounts that certain member states deign to pay into the European Union. We're talking about the future of our continent. We want more security at the border, more internal security. We want to consolidate the economic and monetary union, fight with disequalities, do everything possible to increase growth, render Erasmus accessible and available to more young people. It's very all well and good to want this, but we have to finance it. Commissioner Oettinger has a lot of values, but he's not Father Christmas. The European Union needs the means and resources to meet up to the challenges that I've just run through. If we don't have the money to do this, then who does this benefit? The populists who want to take us back to the 18th century. I don't want somebody in the future to say that the collapse of the European Union started around the time that we're discussing this now, because people didn't want to pay more money into the budget, but only gave these homeopathic doses. And we know that a lot of people are aware of the challenges, but I think there has to be a little more fervent support for all of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goerens. Now, Thomas Weitz for 1 minute. And the money for agriculture and rural development is okay if we meet the challenges of this time. We won't achieve the Paris climate goals if we don't make our agriculture green. We won't be able to keep rural jobs if we cut money for rural development and agriculture. We won't have European biodiversity if European agriculture isn't greened. So I appeal to you so that the agricultural budget is maintained under the condition that agriculture is properly greened. On additional resources, kerosene tax is overdue. I don't see why train tickets to Strasbourg or Brussels cost a lot more than a plane ticket. Such a tax can only be transnational. The same goes for an FTT, or do we want to wait for the next financial crisis? And we ought to know better. Thank you, Mr. Weitz. The next speaker is Miguel Viegas for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The multi-annual financial framework shows how the Union is doing in terms of the gap between its desires and its ability to achieve them. Salaries in Europe, in Portugal, in the last 15 years have gone up by 2%, whereas they've gone up by 3% in Germany. This is because of the present MFF, where cohesion funding was substantially cut compared with the previous programming period. So what we want is a multi-annual financial framework which is reinforced with more funding available for cohesion and not something geared to security and defence spending. So we need to know today whether we want a Europe that shows more solidarity, a Europe of peace, a Europe of cohesion, or do we want a fortress Europe, a militarised Europe, which is more and more belligerent? Thank you, President.
Thank you, Mr. Viegas. The next speaker is Bill Etheridge for 1 minute.
Thank you. Cut your coat to suit your cloth. Spend to suit your income. The anti-logic of this place rejects sound and sane economics. Instead, you look to ever more desperate ways to squeeze the taxpayer until the pips squeak. Interference in member state tax systems, introduction of new EU-wide taxes, abolition of national vetoes. In short, spend, spend, spend and spend again, soon reality will hit. The truth is that sooner or later you will run out of other people's money. The time will come when the grand ideas of this project will be unaffordable, and this will reach even this place. I think some reality is starting to come through now. But when the real truth of financial sanity really hits you, that will be the end of this place and this project.
Kiitokset edustaja Etheridge.
Thank you, Mr. Etheridge. The next speaker is Barbara Kappel for 1 minute.
Danke.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Commissioner Oettinger. The withdrawal of the UK from the EU creates a 40 billion hole. It's not easy to make up. We're talking about own finances of 100 billion. There are new priorities, migration, fighting terrorism, which increase the budget, the MMF 2027. Means it's challenging both on the spending and income side. In the last MFF, 72% went to the CAP and the structural funds. There might be cuts there, and there is the first opposition to that. There are two programs which haven't been cut, Horizon 2020 and Erasmus+. That makes sense. Program alliance like COSME or the CEF are also important growth and jobs drivers. There is opposition by net payments. The Parliament foresees 1.3%. A group of 5 net paying countries, including Austria, has been against this. So there is a difficult task, because without huge savings and reform of own resources, it won't be possible to have a sustainable financing of the EU budget and to have those programs in the program which are wished for and which have a proper European added value. You need to make sure that everybody has the same bite at the cherry and that nobody gets more speaking time than they've asked for. But let's move on in the speakers list. Mr. Sikorski is the next speaker for 1 minute.
Thank you. The safety and security of our citizens is one of our priorities, and obviously that also includes food security, which has been possible through the CAP. The Common Agricultural Policy is one of the first policies which was fully financed from community resources. If we take a look at if we want to maintain the level of the funding of CAP, we know that in very many member states there's a lack of young farmers. Agriculture is an aging sector. And what are the reasons for this? It's partly because income of farmers is considerably lower than average income of other sectors. And so they need support from community resources. If we don't provide them with enough to guarantee a living, they will go bankrupt. And that means we know that our agriculture obviously plays another role as well, protecting the environment. Agriculture and farming also is facing challenges, although we know that it can help us in energy challenges, protect the climate. We can also create new jobs. And it obviously produce a lot of products which can be seen as public goods.
Mr. Sikorski, your speaking time is up. Thank you. On we go. The next speaker is Eric Andrieu for 1 minute.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, budgetary choices can't and shouldn't take place at the expense of food security and food sovereignty. Yes, Europeans have changed in the way they consume, and the way that we produce food needs to change too, to make certain that we can guarantee healthy food for our 500 million citizens. So agriculture is going to have to change too, to take part in this and address problems of climate change and migration. We need to protect our soil, our air, our earth, our land, But first of all, we need to make certain, before any of that happens, that we guarantee farmers' incomes. That means that the CAP budget needs to be maintained. We can't call on farmers to change, at the same time taking away the money which we give to agriculture and food production to occur. So please help us win over the Council, Commissioner, that we need an ambitious budget here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrieu. Now, Terry Reinke for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, dear Commissioner, the name of the EU budget, the multi-annual financial framework, seems like we talk about something that is actually really technical. But in fact, this multi-annual financial framework is deeply political, and it will give us the possibility to either build a European Union for the future that is based on values and principles, or to go back to the past. And that is why the MFF should address the shrinking space for civil society that we are observing all over the European Union. Because human rights defenders have to be able to count on us. With Donald Trump on the one side and Vladimir Putin on the other side, the European Union is the stronghold of fundamental rights and values. And this is why, dear Commissioner, keep up the good work of, for example, the EU's human rights instruments, but also for inside of the European Union, create a fund that is there to defend rule of law and fundamental rights within the European Union. It's direly needed. We need it to build a Europe for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Reinke. Angelo Ciocca, now for 1 minute.
As an Italian MEP, I say no to new taxes levied on Italian citizens, no to new European taxes, no to the craziness of keep heaping tax upon tax. If you want to get resources, get them back from where you're chucking them away. This is an example. Strasbourg, the money that we've seen wasted for giving money to Turkey, financing culture. Let's stop doing these criminal things. Let's see an ordinary family, a mother, a father, a child. Look at the level of tax pressure in Italy. It's destroying families in Italy. It's impossible now for children to go on to have children themselves. In a situation such as this, as tragic as this, as terrible as this, you're going to add more taxes. I'm going to pour this water in to demonstrate it. Here's more European taxes. And that's, again, a further burden on Italian families. They want something simple. Let's have a 15% flat tax. Reduce the level of tax to 15% to give children and families a chance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ciocca, for that very graphic demonstration. And Ivana Malicic, now for 1 minute.
Zahvaljujem predsjedavajuća, pozdravljam povjerenika Oettingera I zahvaljujem I čestitam svim izvjestiteljima I kolegama.
I would like to congratulate all the rapporteurs and colleagues who've worked on these reports. There are 4 principles. The EU budget is too small and the challenges are too big. Secondly, we need more coordination and synergies between the member states. Thirdly, cohesion and agriculture policy are of key importance because they strengthen the single market and everybody benefits from that. And including the most developed countries, which are net payers. Fourthly, I'd like to support colleague Mureşan, who said that our goal should be that we will get a consensus on the budget earlier. Thank you, Ms. Maletic. The next speaker is Timo Völken for 1 minute.
Sehr geehrte Frau Präsidentin.
Madam President, thank you very much. Every year we look at this rather unworthy spectacle. We see that the member states want to reduce their contributions to the MFF. And then the European Union is taking on more tasks, such as the European Defence Union. So the time has come to say that if we can organise our defence at the European level, then we should also be able to organise a true European budget, which requires more own resources. So just let's say this ugly word, own resources, new own resources for the European Union. It doesn't really hurt all that much to say the word. But it's not just a fantasy on the part of the pro-Europeans. We're talking about greater efficiency, greater effective. It would ease national burdens, and it would turn the European Union into a true budget for the European Union. We want Erasmus. We want to be able to fight youth employment. We want to finalise digital transition, so that we have proper broadband rollout. And I think we have to send out a signal to the heads of government, state and government, that we want more of these kind of measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vulcan. The next speaker is Andrei Novakov for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Wanting more and more from the European Union, wanting to make more people believe in the European Union, and yet reducing budgets is comparable to punching a hole in the tank of a car and kind of hoping that it would still be able to keep going. Actually, having good roads, good, well-maintained schools, etc., is not a luxury. It is something that everybody needs. It's a common good, and we need to work for it together. And that is why we need good funding. And the most important thing we need to say today is that there are no longer differences. There shouldn't be differences between the North and the South and the East and the West. We need to be united, and if we need to cut some budgets, let us do it there where it hurts the less. And we need good contributions from the member states.
Thank you, Mr. Novakov. The next speaker is Georgi Pirinsky for 1 minute.
Thank you. The exemplary report before us makes the stark conclusion that the current MFF quickly proved its inadequacy to meet actual needs and political ambitions. It was pushed to its limits after only 2 years. There must be no repetition of this situation post-2020, or the Union will further slip into terminal existential crisis. Additional priorities, such as defence, should not be financed at the expense of solidarity. Today, the Commission is presenting its so-called social fairness package. This and the social pillar cannot remain toothless statements. There must be all necessary resources, among others, for a real child guarantee, overturning the paradox of a union of riches with children in poverty. And not least, resources for an upgraded European Social Fund, able to foster social investment by also blending with financial instruments where appropriate and feasible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pirinsky. The next speaker is Lefteris Christoforou for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm firmly convinced that if we are going to move forward with the MFF, we need to do so trying to achieve a stronger, fairer Europe. And to do that, we need to have certain specific policies which reflect what we want to do in the present and future Europe. We should start by beefing up programs for young people. Secondly, we should do something which everybody wants us to do, have genuine equality between men and women. Thirdly, have increased social cohesion. And fourthly, foster policies which will help island countries such as Malta and Cyprus, and have a proper defence and security policy which will guarantee the dignity of the European Union by making certain its borders are safe, and make certain that we deal with the natural resources that are enjoyed by all member states when it comes to energy. We also need to make certain that production is fostered. Seventhly, support SMEs and make sure that they can join in the new digital economy. That's the only way that we'll actually be able to meet the requirements and desires of our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Christoforou. Now, Jonas Fernandez for 1 minute.
Yes, thank you very much, President. Commissioner, we're holding a very important debate today, which is going to mark the future of the European Union. It's the debate where what we need to do is broaden and improve the own resources of the European Union. Within this own resources package and in the report that we have, we focus on the need that the beneficiaries and the EEIB also make a contribution to the budget of the European Union, that they build up this pillar within the Eurozone. This is a very useful instrument that is being proposed, which will provide a couple of billion a year. This isn't a kind of tax, if you will. We're not asking the citizens or the taxpayers of the European Union to pay more tax. It's a different channel of own resources. And we aren't going to require a change to the treaties of the European Union. What we have to do is stress the value of belonging to the euro, render it more practical. And I think the Council really has to listen to the message we're trying to send.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez. The next speaker is Francisco José Milán Mon. For 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. The next MFF is going to be very important for many citizens and regions. It's played a crucial role in the CAP and it's helped strengthen social and territorial and economic cohesion. It needs to continue to play that role. We can't let our citizens down and give arguments to the populists and anti-Europeans. So all member states need to make an effort in the next MFF to make sure that our farmers, stock raisers and fishermen are still provided with EU financing and were to allow cohesion policies to continue. Since the Erasmus Plus programme to innovation and training and strengthening our borders and helping sub-Saharan countries and countries that border on Europe, guaranteeing people's incomes, meeting the challenges of migration. There are all sorts of challenges and we need to stay together to try to meet them. All member states need to make an effort here, ever more now when we're going to be lacking the UK contribution because of Brexit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Milán Mon. Now, Ellie Schlein for 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente. All'Unione
Thanks, Madam President. We need a multi-annual budget which is up to the task when you look at the challenges that we're facing. That's why we need own resources. We are still the biggest development aid provider in the world, and it's vital that the new multi-annual budget be at the commensurate with the commitments we've entered into. Let's be honest. Changes have occurred in the world since the new this agenda, the Paris agreements, everything has happened since the last MFF began. We need, therefore, to make certain we can meet these challenges, or the budget will simply remain something that looks fine on paper. Also, we need to respect the principles of transparency and effectiveness as far as aid is concerned, and make sure our policies are consistent. We also need to make certain that development aid and humanitarian aid are always available as far as financing is concerned. We need to look at the added value, and we shouldn't change the original goals of the instruments for cooperation. They should be eradicating poverty and not just blocking migrant flows. Let's remember that we need long-term investments if we are going to meet these global challenges. Otherwise, we'll all lose. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ms. Schlein. The next speaker is Inese Vaidere for 1 minute.
Dear colleagues, Mr. Ossingen, this will be the first DFS where we first identify the issues to be tackled and then look for the resources to carry it out. The most burning issue for our citizens is security, and we therefore must fund resources for safeguarding our external borders, which then will ensure smooth functioning of Schengen area. Additional funding is also needed for the youth programme, science, SMEs, in other words, for our future competitiveness. Our people want to live better in all of the EU, and therefore the cohesion policy should be aimed at equalising the development levels between member states. Here important is infrastructure. Let's not forget Connecting Europe facility, including Rail Baltic project. Our future is environmentally friendly and resource efficiently technology, and so we should especially focus on new technologies and research. Also, the financing for CAP differs significantly among the member states, and we must strive towards greater cohesion here. Finally, to fill the gaps created by the Brexit, we will certainly need to increase the commitments of the member states and to tackle future challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vaidere. The last speaker on the list is Ivo Bellet for 1 minute.
Voorzitter, meneer de commissaris.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Commissioner, colleagues. Good afternoon. I think we can say that citizens expect from the EU that we have security, social protection, defence and climate protection. People expect of the EU that we protect them in all these areas, and that we invest in European projects which have a clear European added value. And for that, we need additional resources. They can come from additional resources. For example, emission trading system evidently is bringing more, and that's been proposed by the Environment Committee. We can have intelligent cuts, but we can't tell people that saving on the cohesion funds would mean less, 350 million less per year in Flanders. We have to say that clearly to citizens. We have to counter fake information. We must criticize fake information and rip the mask off their face. Mr. Bellet, we have quite a long catch the eye procedure. 15 requests for the floors. I can only accept about half of those. I ask for your understanding. We'll proceed in the normal procedure. The first speaker in Catch the Eye is Monteiro de Aguiar, Mrs. Monteiro de Aguiar.
Onko rouva Monteiro Aguiar täällä?
Is she here? No. Oh, sorry.
En huomannut.
Thanks very much, President. This is one of the most important debates in the life of this Parliament because we're defining priorities for the next multi-annual financial framework. The Parliament drew up its list of priorities. We've done our job, and tomorrow we have to approve commitments which will show the citizens of Europe what we represent. I'd ask the Commission to recognise and act upon this and come up with a powerful budget that's commensurate with the Parliament's list of desires. We need to have two main priorities that the Commission needs to look at very carefully. The next MFF needs to look at the post-2020 system and have more cohesion policy, particularly trying to address problems faced by outermost regions. I'm talking about having specific support for transport, fisheries, agriculture, strengthening things to help young people and also SMEs. And finally, final point, let's have a specific budget line for tourism, which is a vitally important sector for us. And we think the Commission could do that.
I have to say that we have such a long list under Catch the Eye that if you speak 1.5 times of your time, it's time away from other colleagues. The next speaker is Mr. Blanco Lopez for 1 minute. And please stick to that 1 minute.
Presidenta.
Yes, thank you very much, President. We won't have more Europe with less resources, nor will we have more cohesion, territorial cohesion, if we cut the cohesion funds and if we cut the CAP and the fisheries funds, which are so important for regions like my own, the region of Galicia. We're not going to be able to face up to new challenges, face up to climate change, or do something about innovation and depopulation with ever fading resources. And we're never going to be able to overcome this equality gap. We have had the crisis, and in very many areas of Europe, rather than seeing convergence, we see divergence. There are ways of trying to increase the budget. There is the financial transaction tax, there's an eco tax, also what we call the seigneuriage, the monies from the IB. So more resources to face up to challenges and the objective that we have to have a European Union which is based on more cohesion, more territorial, a greater territorial structure. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Howarth for 1 minute.
Madam President, force to social cohesion in a nation, and no greater threat to the future of Europe than the fear and reality of unemployment. And so it's with a great deal of pride that I can support the priority my group is giving to combating unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment, in the next MFF. And we need, Commissioner Oettinger, the programmes that this European Union runs in this area to be effective and to be properly taken up. The priority is indeed jobs, but a priority is also the transformation of the economy through investment in knowledge, technology, innovation, investment, science and research, because the old economy that we have will not do. It will not deliver the jobs that those young people need. If the future of Europe is the future of freedom, then it is also the future of hope for the next generation.
Thank you. Bang on 1 minute. Now, Rosa Tomasic.
Gospođo predsjedavajuća, kohezijska politika iza 2020. dovedena je u pitanje.
Thank you. We're looking at the MFF post 2020 and the policies we want to fund, but the situation, I think, is under question. I can only agree with the rapporteurs, and that is that we have to retain the kind of main policies for investment. Obviously, in the member states, unless we have the right level of resources, we can't have a functioning single market. There are differing levels of development in the member states, and we have to be careful that we don't create the impression that the richer member states are exploiting the not so well-off member states. That's not good for the stability of the European Union. We have to maintain the cohesion policy and strengthen it and focus on what has been successful. I think there are better ways of spending the money and achieving our cohesion objectives. And if we take a look at the migration policy and funds and linking it to cohesion, that's not all that good, and there is no consensus here, and I think that's only damaging for cohesion funds.
Just listening to the end of the interpretation. It was slightly delayed, but it was better to wait. Mr. Houtema, for 1 minute.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Beste commissaris. Wat me opvalt van...
Thank you, President. Commissioner, what struck me this afternoon is we've not talked about how to use European money more efficiently, to make certain that we use taxpayers' money properly. We want a European Union that is stable and invests in the future, but it's not something that comes automatically. We're just saying we need more money without looking at areas where we might actually save money. Economies, national parliaments, everybody should look and see whether they want to spend more money and then see where they can get it from. instead of automatically thinking that they can just get more. People keep talking about fresh money, and we're not talking about a small amount more either. We're talking about 30% more. The world is changing, and we need to adjust. We need to modernise. We need to be more critical about how we spend money. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hautenoa. Lydia Senra, for 1 minute now.
Senra, olkaa hyvä.
Thanks, Madam President. Commissioner, this debate is about what Europe we've got and what Europe we want to have. So we need to make sure that so-called net contributing countries do get proper returns, and that we try to use money that they provide to generate more wealth. We've not managed to allow the countries outside the economic heart of Europe to develop properly, but in the name of modernisation they've been told to dismantle their productive fabric. Just look at what's happening in the fisheries in my region of Galicia. The funds did allow in the past that outlying countries could have easier access to markets, but at the moment it's more simply being forced to pay more attention to European capital. We're not developed yet. People say that they are, whereas look at young people who are voting with their feet and just leaving these countries so that they can find a job somewhere else. Commissioner, until now we haven't had proper solidarity. We need to change things. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was more than a minute. The next speaker, Patricia Sulin.
Thank you very much for the floor, President. EU funding allows us to achieve common European goals, and a well-functioning union is beneficial for all its member states. We have to say that clearly and take it into account in European budgetary discussions. And that way, we will be able to ensure adequate funding for those traditional priorities, such as the internal market, agriculture and cohesion policies, which are very important for Slovenia. New challenges include security and the defense of our external borders. Failing there would mean putting into jeopardy all our 4 fundamental freedoms. In the current system of national contributions, the EU focus is lost in a sea